Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about sovereignty in A-level politics. So that's not just all the content and knowledge you need to know with key specific examples, but also key points of analysis and the most likely questions you could get asked in the exam so that you can be fully prepared. I'm going to start by kind of going over the key debates and questions you could get asked in the exam. From there, I'm going to give you an introduction to sovereignty and the difference between legal and political sovereignty. I'm then going to go into the extent to which legal sovereignty has moved between different branches of government in the last few decades, before finally looking at where sovereignty now lies in the United Kingdom, before circling back to those questions to suggest how you could potentially answer them with the content we've gone through. So yeah, if you want to access a PDF that you can see up there, go to the first link in the description to the Politics Explained website, where you can also sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in, as well as find a lot of useful resources to help you in your politics A-level, including kind of comprehensive sets of notes and everything you need to know guides, and lots of essay plans to help you in your A-level. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the kind of key debates and past or kind of possible essay questions. So in terms of the key debate in relation to this topic, it's in relation to how sovereignty is distributed in the UK and the extent to which the UK Parliament remains sovereign. If you make a detailed essay plan on the question in bold, which you can then kind of adapt to different kind of questions that could come up, you should be really well prepared for the exam. To be honest, it's a very small topic, and kind of there's pretty much only kind of one. If you make that essay plan, you should be pretty well prepared because there's likely one type of question that can get asked, and that is kind of where does sovereignty now lie in the UK, and the extent to which it has moved from Parliament, or the extent to which Parliament retains that sovereignty. So the question I've kind of put in bold to suggest you plan is evaluate the view that Parliament is no longer sovereign in the UK. There will soon be on the Politics Explained website, that will be one of the essay plans as part of the UK government essay plans package, if you want to look at the one I've made rather than making it yourself. So yeah, starting off with an introduction to sovereignty and the concept of sovereignty. So what is sovereignty? Sovereignty is a power which can't be overruled, and it's the source of all other political powers. So a sovereign body can delegate its powers to others, but reserves the right to recover these powers, take them back whenever it wants to. So sovereignty is the source of all powers, effectively, right? It can only be removed or transferred, at least in a democracy, by some special procedures, which usually involve popular consent. And that's where the kind of difference between legal and political sovereignty comes in. So legal sovereignty is a concept defined in law. It belongs to the person or body in a state with unlimited legal authority. And in the UK, it's traditionally belonged to Parliament. I'll go through kind of parliamentary sovereignty in a minute. But standing behind that, or in a way standing above that, is political or popular sovereignty, which is kind of sovereignty in practice or kind of in reality. So in a democracy, the legal sovereign body in the UK, which traditionally being Parliament, is legally sovereign, but it's only sovereign, it only has that kind of power which can't be overruled, because it derives its authority from the people in elections. So when the people elect a Parliament, they delegate their political authority, their political sovereignty, to their representatives, who then have legal sovereignty. So Parliament has legal sovereignty. The people therefore have real political sovereignty, as through elections they delegate legal sovereignty to Parliament, and at every election, if they aren't happy with that Parliament, they remove them and kind of replace them with another Parliament. So they can remove representatives if they want to, and therefore they give a new Parliament legal sovereignty. And if necessary, so say Parliament, the government becomes kind of a dictatorship and tries to take too much power, the people still have political sovereignty because they can ultimately revolt against that government. So legal sovereignty is a concept defined in law. Legal sovereignty only exists because of political sovereignty, which the people have, or popular sovereignty, which stands above it and therefore kind of grants legal sovereignty. But a lot of kind of the questions you're going to get asked, to say, when it's saying, is Parliament still sovereign in the UK? That's talking about legal sovereignty. Of course, you're going to be bringing in kind of political and popular sovereignty and say, actually, Parliament was only ever legally sovereign. It wasn't popular sovereignty. But those questions often speak. So parliamentary sovereignty refers to legal sovereignty, not popular sovereignty. So now I'm going to look at parliamentary sovereignty in the UK. So how can different bodies hold legal sovereignty? So in different countries, different bodies hold the legal sovereignty. So for example, in the US, it's the codified constitution that is sovereign. In the UK, it's Parliament that's traditionally been sovereign. So constitutional theorist A.V. Dicey was important to setting this out in 1885 when he argued that the two key pillars underpinning the UK Constitution were parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. For quite a bit more detail on that, go to the video on the Policy Explained YouTube channel on the nature and sources of the UK Constitution. So now looking at parliamentary sovereignty. So parliamentary sovereignty refers to the fact that the UK Parliament is legally sovereign within the UK Constitution. And parliamentary sovereignty, as I went through with A.V. Dicey, is traditionally been quite a key part of the UK Constitution. Parliament's for a long time been sovereign. So what does that mean? It means it's the key lawmaking and amending body in Britain. So when Dicey was writing, it was the only lawmaking and amending body, so there weren't 12 bodies. It can make laws on any subject, including making changes to the Constitution. It cannot bind its successors, nor be bound by its predecessors. So no law, including constitutional laws, can be entrenched. And even if a parliament tries to entrench a law, the next parliament can just go and remove that law. So there's not really a way that it can be entrenched. And no court or higher body, including the Supreme Court, can strike down a law passed by Parliament. So when we're talking about in a question, to what extent is Parliament still sovereign, we're kind of referring to what extent do all of those still apply. So, I'm going to look at now the extent to which legal sovereignty has moved between different branches of government in the kind of past few decades. So, in the mid-20th century, the legal sovereignty of Parliament was unquestionable. It was kind of the only lawmaking body in Britain. The UK wasn't part of the EU, as we're going to move some parliamentary sovereignty, and it could make laws on any subject, and it did make laws on any subject. But the following developments I'm going to go through now have taken place in recent decades, have challenged this legal sovereignty of Parliament, and can be seen as watering it down or weakening it to a certain extent by transferring some legal sovereignty to different branches of government. So popular sovereignty, political sovereignty that stands above it, hasn't been kind of removed at all, hasn't been questioned, but the kind of legal sovereignty of Parliament can be argued to be weakened down a bit, have been kind of weakened or watered down a bit. The first of these is in relation to the EU. So, when the UK was a member of the EU, it can be argued to have transferred some legal sovereignty to the EU. So, in 1972, the UK passed the European Communities Act, which meant it joined the European Economic Community, which then developed into the EU. And in doing so, the UK accepted the supremacy of EU law over laws passed by Parliament, and therefore the sovereignty of EU law. So, what that meant is that EU law on issues was kind of on issues that EU did make laws on. So, that's not everything, especially kind of trade. Agriculture are two kind of key examples of that, stood above UK law. So what that meant is that if a law was passed by the UK Parliament that contradicted EU law, then the European Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the EU, and the Supreme Court also in the UK, could strike that law down and force Parliament to remove or change it. So that's a pretty key way in which the UK Parliament is no longer sovereign over the issues in which EU law pertained to. So the supremacy of this EU law was confirmed in the Facta Tame case, when the Law Lords ruled that the Merchant Shipping Act of 1988, passed by the UK Parliament, breached EU law as it required UK registered ships to have a majority of British owners, and as a consequence, the UK Parliament was forced to unmake the law. So it's an example of how the Supreme Court and the European Court of Justice can strike down laws passed by Parliament. The EU controlled many significant areas of policy, in particular trade, agriculture, fisheries, and many other aspects of regulation. And as I said, this limited the extent to which Parliament was the key lawmaking body in the UK, as there were key areas of policy that it didn't and couldn't legislate on. So that's kind of, on the one hand, that can be used to suggest that, there was a lot of sovereignty, like legal sovereignty was lost to Parliament. On the other hand, there's some debates in relation to that. So kind of, a lot of people, including kind of Eurosceptics who supported Brexit, argued that kind of a lot of sovereignty was lost to the EU. Sovereignty is indivisible, and therefore they saw the only way to regain it is withdrawing from the EU. So there was no longer that higher law. That was a key theme of the Brexit campaign, which used the slogan "Take Back Control." On the other hand, moderate Eurosceptics and some kind of in the centre argued that sovereignty could be reclaimed by negotiating opt-outs from EU policies to which they objected. So, for example, Britain opted out from joining the euro as a currency and therefore retained sovereignty over its kind of economic sovereignty, control over interest rates. So, in comparison to some other countries in the EU, the UK, through opt-outs, was able to retain a significant amount of sovereignty. And then those who supported EU membership sometimes argued that sovereignty, though some legal sovereignty may have been lost in the sense there was higher law, UK also gained sovereignty by being in the EU because its sovereignty was pooled with the sovereignty of other countries, where they could make decisions together and therefore have more power on the global stage and gain more influence. Therefore, that's the kind of concept of pooled sovereignty, and the argument that actually the UK could potentially gain some sovereignty by joining the EU. Since Brexit, of course, the UK can be seen as regaining parliamentary sovereignty in that kind of legal sovereignty as we've left the EU, so there's no longer that higher law. The next kind of development that can be seen as transferring legal sovereignty away from Parliament is devolution. So devolution was introduced by Labour following the 1997 election and transferred the authority to make law on certain subjects to bodies other than the UK Parliament. So the Scottish Parliament and Northern Irish Parliament in particular gained primary legislative control over many areas, including health, education, whilst the Welsh Parliament gained the same powers in the 2010s. The Greater London Authority and city regions in England have also gained significant administrative control, but not necessarily legal sovereignty. Since the Wales Act of 2014 and the Scotland Act of 2016, both countries also have the power to vary taxation. So that's significant powers that the Scotland and Welsh Parliament now have, that the UK Parliament could be argued to no longer have. So devolution can therefore be seen as having reduced parliamentary sovereignty over Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland by kind of transferring it to the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish Parliaments. Next development is the use of referendums. So in the past few decades, there have been a number of referendums on key constitutional issues, such as Scottish independence, Brexit, the electoral system in the AV referendum, and devolution in the 1997-1998 devolution referendums. And as a consequence, it can be argued that a convention has developed that the people should be consulted in a referendum before a significant constitutional change is introduced. Though these referendums are theoretically advisory and not binding on Parliament, the use of referendums arguably challenges parliamentary sovereignty, as Parliament is very unlikely to defy the kind of will of the people expressed in a referendum. And it can be argued, therefore, practically, if not kind of theoretically, because theoretically Parliament could still ignore the result of a referendum, but practically and realistically, it can be argued that the consent of the people in a referendum is needed before any major constitutional changes, and parliamentary sovereignty has therefore been transferred to the people, to some popular sovereignty with regard to key constitutional changes. So the people obviously always have the kind of political sovereignty that stands above legal sovereignty, but in the area of key constitutional changes, it can be argued they now have that legal sovereignty as well. Final thing I'm going to look at is the Human Rights Act and the Supreme Court. So the Human Rights Act of 1998 gave the judiciary the power to rule on whether subsequent laws were compatible with it, and to issue declarations of incompatibility to try and persuade Parliament to change the kind of offending law if it broke the Human Rights Act, if it wasn't kind of compatible with the Human Rights Act. And it can therefore be seen as limiting the sovereignty of Parliament to pass laws on any subject they wish. On the other hand, though, Parliament can ignore, though it often doesn't, Parliament can ignore the Supreme Court's declarations of incompatibility, and ultimately Parliament could remove or replace the Human Rights Act with a simple majority if it wanted to. So I'd argue that's a bit of a weaker argument. Further, the creation of the Supreme Court in the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 can be seen as challenging parliamentary sovereignty, as it moved the UK's highest court out of the House of Lords, which obviously was part of Parliament. This increased judicial independence and was designed to make the Supreme Court a more effective check on Parliament and the government, as can be seen in the 2019 prorogation of Parliament case. But on the other hand, the Supreme Court could theoretically be abolished by an act of Parliament, and it still doesn't have powers to strike down laws passed by Parliament, and therefore Parliament can be argued to still be sovereign. So yeah, that's first kind of talk about the developments which may have transferred or can be argued to have transferred power away from Parliament. Now we're going to look at where does sovereignty now lie in the UK and the kind of key debates over it. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the executive. It's something we haven't looked at so far. So it can be argued that parliamentary sovereignty is actually, and in reality, executive sovereignty, as the government can usually dominate Parliament due to its large majority. And Lord Hailsham called this an elective dictatorship, where effectively the government, because it has so much power over Parliament and can pass laws so easily once it's elected, kind of has the power of a dictatorship. The executive controls most of the parliamentary agenda and is able to use whipping and its large majority just to ensure they very rarely lose votes. For example, Tony Blair lost just 4 votes across his 10 years as Prime Minister, while since the Second World War, over 99% of votes in the House of Commons have been won by the government. So that's a way in which actually it can be argued that actually it isn't Parliament that has legal sovereignty. In practice, it's the executive because they have so much power. But on the other hand, the executive is only able to exert so much kind of control over Parliament because it has a majority in Parliament. So in reality, it can still be seen as it's even if it's the government, like a lot of the MPs just doing what the government says, they're still MPs, they're still in Parliament, and therefore it's still parliamentary sovereignty. Whilst recently, the executive has been able to exert less control over Parliament, as it's often had a smaller majority, for example, in the coalition or kind of minority governments. So the minority government of Theresa May, for example, suffered a lot of defeat. So in that sense, it can be argued that actually, does the UK have an elected dictatorship? Potentially not, and therefore it's actually still Parliament that's sovereign. The next kind of group that can be said to have sovereignty in the UK is the people. So the people always ultimately have political sovereignty, right, as we kind of went through at the start, with which they grant Parliament and other bodies legal sovereignty through election. So that's unquestionable. The people always have political sovereignty. But since the increased use of referendums, kind of I just went through, it can also be argued that people now have legal sovereignty over key constitutional changes, as it would be highly politically unlikely that Parliament would ignore a referendum result, and it has become a convention for referendums to be held on key constitutional issues. So the people obviously always have political sovereignty, or kind of popular sovereignty, but you can argue they also have recently gained some legal sovereignty. The next group, or next kind of bodies that can be said to have legal sovereignty in the UK are devolved bodies. So on the one hand, devolved bodies can be argued to have significant sovereignty. So they have significant powers to make laws on a range of policy areas, including over areas of taxation, and therefore have a significant amount of legal sovereignty, which the UK Parliament no longer has in Scotland or Wales, for example. Because in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament has sovereignty over kind of matters in relation to health or education, for example. Further, the Sewell Convention, which stipulates that Parliament, the UK Parliament that is, cannot legislate on devolved areas without the permission from the relevant devolved assembly, was recognised in the Scotland Act of 2016 and the Wales Act of 2017. So not only is it a convention, it's also been recognised in statute. And that kind of could be argued to kind of really strengthen the idea that Parliament has lost sovereignty, as it is very much supposed to ask Scotland or Wales and get its consent before it legislates on, for example, health or education. And therefore it doesn't have, can be argued to not have legal sovereignty in those areas. Further, though the UK Parliament theoretically could reverse devolution and kind of abolish the devolved bodies without a referendum, and technically still can pass legislation on devolved bodies, as the above act only recognises the Sewell Convention, they don't kind of, it's not kind of entrenched in law at all. They only kind of recognise that the convention exists, and that conventions are obviously very flexible, and the convention could no longer apply if the government didn't want it to. These actions would be politically highly unlikely. That's the reason there is a convention, right? As it would create a constitutional crisis, and devolved bodies are a deeply ingrained part of British politics. So even though theoretically and legally the UK Parliament could abolish the devolved bodies and could just legislate on devolved matters, because the Sewell Convention is only a convention, politically it's highly unlikely. There's a reason it's a convention, and that's because it's kind of recognised across the political spectrum that devolved bodies have legitimacy, and therefore if the UK Parliament tried to abolish them without a referendum, there'd be a massive backlash, and it can be seen as kind of politically impossible. So in practice, the sovereignty of the UK Parliament can be argued to have been reduced, therefore. On the other hand, devolution ultimately isn't a federal settlement with a kind of formal legal sharing of sovereignty between different levels of government. Instead, it can be argued that Parliament has granted power down to the devolved bodies, which it can then legally take back. Parliament could theoretically and legally abolish the devolved bodies and reverse devolution, as I said, and also the Sewell Convention is just a convention which isn't legally binding and doesn't formally limit the power of Parliament. Though, to be fair, a lot of the UK Constitution works on these conventions, which are relatively strong. Further, there's a couple of recent examples that show the sovereignty of the devolved bodies has been limited by the UK Parliament, and have kind of restated the sovereignty of Parliament, it could be argued. So in 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that the consent of the UK Parliament was necessary to legislate for a second independence referendum in Scotland, despite the SNP arguing otherwise. So if the Scottish Parliament wants to hold a second independence referendum, it needs the consent of the UK Parliament. That kind of can be seen as restating the sovereignty of Parliament. Further, in January 2023, Rishi Sunak used a Section 35 order for the first time to block Scotland's proposed gender reform bill, which would have introduced self-identification for those who wanted to change gender and allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to do so. So Section 35 of the Scotland Act allows the UK government to block a bill from a devolved body in exceptional circumstances if it believes it will have an adverse impact on UK-wide law. So for the first time, Rishi Sunak used that Section 5 of the Scotland Act, and that can be seen as kind of restating, or kind of maybe slightly increasing and kind of restating the sovereignty of UK Parliament as it had never been used before, and kind of restating the sovereignty of UK Parliament over issues in relation to Scotland. If it kind of wants to, the UK Parliament can issue those orders in exceptional circumstances. So next one is the judiciary. So following the passage of the Human Rights Act of 1998 and the establishment of the Supreme Court by the Constitutional Reform Act, it can be argued that the Supreme Court has some sovereignty in relation to interpreting and ensuring the implementation of rights in the UK. This sovereignty is ultimately very limited, however, as the Human Rights Act and declarations of incompatibility aren't binding on Parliament. And theoretically, both the Human Rights Act and the Supreme Court could be removed or replaced by Parliament at any time, whilst the judiciary has no power to strike down laws passed by Parliament. So therefore, Parliament can still be argued to be sovereign in that area. And then finally, key one we're going to look at is Parliament. So on the one hand, the ways in which Parliament can still be seen as sovereign. So the UK Parliament remains the ultimate legal authority in the UK. It can pass laws on any subject and isn't subordinate to any other body in law. For example, judges can't strike down laws using the Human Rights Act, just declaring compatibility, and the laws of the UK Parliament can't be struck down by anybody, especially since leaving the EU. Parliament retains the legal power to abolish devolved bodies in component parts of the UK. It can be seen as having transfer powers and functions to devolved bodies, but not sovereignty. So obviously there's some counter arguments to that, but it can be seen that legally and theoretically Parliament is still sovereign, as it could theoretically abolish the devolved bodies. Further, the Article 50 court case confirmed that the UK Parliament remains sovereign even after a referendum. The case also ruled that the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish Parliaments had no right to veto an Act of Parliament giving consent to Article 50. So that can be seen as arguing that actually, yes, there are referendums, but they're advisory, and the UK Parliament is still sovereign because the UK Parliament could say no, even if a referendum voted yes on an issue. And further, though the executive does have a lot of power, this is largely due to its majority in Parliament, and therefore shouldn't be seen as contradicting parliamentary sovereignty. Further, when the government doesn't have a large majority, Parliament is effective in holding the government to account. So their arguments that Parliament very much is still sovereign. On the other hand, there are some arguments that parliamentary sovereignty has been reasserted recently as well. So the UK's withdrawal from the EU in 2020 significantly increased parliamentary sovereignty. In recent decades, it's also become a convention that Parliament is consulted before voting on major military actions, so another way in which Parliament can be said to have increased in sovereignty. When governments have been weak, especially Theresa May's government, Parliament has been effective in challenging the executive. And further, the House of Lords has become more professional following New Labour's reforms. So in these ways, that's where it can be argued that Parliament is still sovereign, not the executive, because Parliament does hold the executive to account. Further, on the 7th of March 2023, Home Secretary Suella Braverman introduced the illegal migration bill, with a Section 19 note stating that there was a likelihood the provisions of the bill would be incompatible with the Human Rights Act and international law, but that the government wanted to proceed with it nonetheless. So this shows the kind of increasingly limited influence of the Supreme Court's declarations of incompatibility with the Human Rights Act, especially in relation to Conservative governments, which often kind of have been saying for a long-term time that they might replace the Human Rights Act. And finally, the Supreme Court's 2022 ruling that set out that Parliament's consent was necessary to call a second Scottish independence referendum, as well as Sunak's Section 35 order, represents a reassertion of parliamentary sovereignty in relation to devolved bodies. So there are some key arguments that not only can Parliament still be seen as sovereign, it can be seen as having that parliamentary sovereignty can be seen as having reasserted itself in recent years. So overall, analysis of sovereignty in the UK. Overall, it can be argued that the people hold political sovereignty in the UK and grant legal sovereignty to other bodies. That's pretty undeniable in a democracy. Parliament holds the majority of legal sovereignty in the UK, especially following the withdrawal of the UK from the EU. But the executive can be seen as exercising most of this sovereignty in practice, especially when it has a large majority in Parliament. Devolved bodies are largely sovereign when it comes to decisions that only affect Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Obviously, all of these you can debate, right? And kind of all of the stuff I've gone through so far, there is very much debates like, is it devolved bodies that hold sovereignty in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or actually does the UK Parliament still? How much sovereignty does legal sovereignty does the UK Parliament still have in relation to referendums, in relation to kind of everything effectively? Is it the executive that holds the kind of exercises sovereignty, or is it Parliament? So none of what I've been saying has been kind of set in stone, because obviously it contradicts each other. They're all debates, and these are the debates you're going to have in your essays. And then finally, the people can be said to have legal sovereignty over key constitutional changes. But as I said, that can be debated as well. So yeah, that's everything in terms of the content. We're going to now look at some kind of key practice essay questions and how you could potentially answer them. So the key one I've recommended planning in detail is evaluate the view that Parliament is no longer sovereign in the UK. And the structure I'd recommend for this one is effectively debating Parliament versus another group or another body that can be said to have sovereignty in 3 paragraphs. So in the first paragraph, you could effectively do it with the executive to say, so it can be argued that parliamentary sovereignty has been limited and Parliament is no longer sovereign because it's actually executive sovereignty, and that sovereignty is exercised by the government. Then you can counter that by saying, with the kind of counter arguments, that actually Parliament can still be said as sovereign, seen as sovereign. That executive sovereignty is really just parliamentary sovereignty, and also Parliament's reasserted itself in recent years. Then you could do exactly the same with devolution. Talk about the arguments that significant parliamentary sovereignty has been lost to devolved bodies, and practically those devolved bodies can't be abolished without a referendum, and their parliament has kind of permanently lost or kind of transferred that sovereignty. Now, you can bring in the counter argument saying that it can be argued that Parliament hasn't permanently lost that sovereignty. Theoretically, it can still reverse the actions of devolved bodies, whilst some recent kind of the 2022 court case and Sunak's Section 35 order can be seen as reasserting parliamentary sovereignty in that area. And then the third paragraph, you could potentially do it in, what would you do for the third paragraph? In relation to the people. So you can say, ultimately, it's the people that has to have political sovereignty. So the people are always politically sovereign in the UK. And recently, they can be seen as having gained legal sovereignty over key constitutional issues. And then bring in the counter arguments for saying that, yes, the people are politically sovereign, but Parliament can still be seen as legally sovereign. And the legal sovereignty of those referendums can be countered by arguing that they're theoretically advisory and Parliament is still legally sovereign. So yeah, that's for that question. So those paragraphs will often work for a lot of questions. Obviously you need to alter them, but the kind of general structure of the paragraphs will work for a lot of questions. But for a different one, for example, evaluate the view that Parliament has recently regained its sovereignty. You could also bring in a paragraph on the EU, right? How the EU used to be, Parliament used to not be sovereign in the kind of the areas that EU control, but it's regained it recently. And you could obviously do different paragraphs. You could bring in the Judiciary Human Rights Act as well, if you wanted to. So yeah, as I said, I'm going to have a detailed essay plan for that question in bold as part of the UK government essay plans on the Politics Explained website, which you can purchase if you're interested. Or feel free, it's often very useful in revision to actually make them yourself. So making that one in bold yourself as well would be really useful. So yeah, that's pretty much everything for this video. If you're interested in further help, go to the Politics Explained website where you can buy those essay plans. As I said, they should soon be available, and the ones for UK politics are already available, as well as you can buy the kind of PDFs with the full sets of notes for UK politics and UK government, and hopefully soon and kind of next year, going to have it covering the whole of the A-level politics as course. And yeah, also there's a place to sign up for tutoring if you'd be interested. But that's pretty much everything. Thank you very much. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.